Ted Shaw, was Brian Southworth, he was the editor of CERN Courier and published a report on the inauguration ceremonies of the EPS, and mentioned that the first Europhysics news would be published on the 15th of November 1968. And he was the first editor of the EPN, of the Europhysics News. Very shortly after, in '69, he asked me whether I would consider compiling a list of meetings, international scientific meetings, main center on physics. And I started that work, and then that resulted in the first issue of the meetings issue of Europhysics News in 1970. And that was a regular publication. Every 6 months we published a meetings issue. And then I joined the editorial board of the Europhysics News and became editor of the whole issue of Europhysics News for 2 years, 1970, 1971, until 1972, when Mr. Crawford took over as an editor employed by the EPS, because I was still employed fully by CERN. But CERN, of course, encouraged us and my colleagues to help and work as far as possible with the EPS. That was really our function, and the Director General at the beginning, B Gregory, encouraged full cooperation with our facilities. We had obviously publication facilities, printing facilities of the very old-fashioned type. Of course, it's nothing to do with modern works. I mean, we worked very primitive, what nowadays be considered rather primitive methods. And I could perhaps mention this, the collecting of the meetings data was very, very strange. The office, office of the Secretariat of the EPS had certain sources of conferences. They compiled them. Then we had scanned journals for any information on meetings. And then lastly, I had to scan the corridors of CERN to find any posters of future meetings and note down the details. I had established in the meetings issue certain standards. We had to give the dates, the title, the venue, and then conditions of registration, dates when first the papers had to be submitted by. And then the conference committee of the EPS had established certain standards for Europhysics conferences. They were specially marked. We had Europhysics study conferences, which were based on the Gordon conferences in the States, no proceedings. So there were different categories of conferences and summer schools, which were all listed. We regularly compiled about 200 odd meetings in each issue, and 2 issues, so we had good 400, 500 meetings going well into the future, perhaps a year or 2 ahead. But it was tedious work, nothing like nowadays where you scan the computer and you get all the data you want. But we had to just physically scan the newspapers, their journals, phone up, look at posters, and then the process of producing the copy for the printer was also tedious. We had to prepare typescript. They were sent to the printers. The printers produced galley proofs. We had to scan the galley proofs, correcting them, back to the printer, or make up the page by gluing the strips of the galley proofs on pages, make up pages, and so on. So it was a very, very primitive, but the traditional process of the time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Then I retired I was continuing at CERN. My function was at CERN was to run the visit service for the public, which I began in '68, and incidentally also produced the house journal, the bulletin of CERN, and so it was parallel work, producing the Europhysics News and producing a journal in CERN. It was a very useful experience. But now to carry on with my activities at EPS, I of course became a member of the conference committee and other committees, and we had regular meetings in between the general conferences. I was able to attend all the general conferences up to Bern last year, in 2005, and except for the first two conferences. So I had close contact with most committees and council members and presidents over the years. And mainly now I can say that my activity was really concerned with making also some propaganda for the EPS on various occasions. Say, are you members of EPS? And encountering many people in the committees, and my activity at the Europhysics News was, for instance, in the first couple of years I was working for, I had a bit of a fight to convince my colleagues on the editorial board that it would be a nice feature to prepare an index, because there was never an index. You had to go through all copy to find the articles. So I produced the first couple of indexes for the first 2 years of subject index and author index, but I'm afraid it wasn't continued. But it was at the time one of the features which we did.
So in your long experience as editor and writer and also activities with the journals, etc., what is the article that you enjoyed most?
Well,
related to EPS, and maybe then I will ask you related to CERN.
Well, they're both very, in my mind, they're very closely knit. There is really no separation, or very little. As far as the EPS activities are concerned, my only involvement was with certain meetings of committees and councils where the main subject was finance. And I'm afraid that was probably a general disease or malaise. Most of the organizations, growing organizations, had to struggle to obtain sufficient finance, and in some cases it was rather critical. I remember a meeting in Split in Yugoslavia, where this topic was very much on the agenda. There was Professor Rudberg was the president, and it was rather serious. But I can only say I'm most pleased that things have completely changed. There were periods when things were not so good. And well, that's it. At CERN, of course, we always collaborated. I joined the editorial advisory committee more or less until my retirement, 1985, under Ted Shaw. And Ted Shaw then became the editor of Europhysics News after he left CERN. But I still joined them at Petit-Lancy with Gero Thomas, worked with him. But altogether, it was an eye-opener. I was privileged to go to many European countries and capitals and meetings where meetings took place. I was even fortunate to, in the 70s, to go back to my hometown. Had left before the war. At Dresden, there was a committee meeting in Leipzig and in Dresden, so I saw my hometown again. The other thing which more or less brings it a full circle, in 1971, when I was editor of Europhysics News, the green issue, which was the main issue, the yellow issue was the meetings issue, CERN asked me to go to Lindau, where annually takes place a meeting of Nobel laureates in physics, chemistry, and medicine. This one was physics. And they meet with students. In those years, it was mainly German-speaking students, but it became more widespread and is now worldwide. But in those days, I was asked to meet Professor Heisenberg, because CERN had a problem with a big accelerator being built in 69, 70. He had voiced the opinion that Germany should not pay towards that machine because it would be unnecessary. a formula, an equation he had worked out would give us all the answers necessary as far as particles were concerned. And I had to find out, he had changed his mind by then, but I was going to find out how his future attitude would be with regard to the accelerator now being planned and built at CERN. And I met him in Lindau, and I wrote an article about this first meeting in Lindau, which I witnessed, which was very fascinating because one had never imagined that laureates would lower themselves to talk to students, young undergraduates, and discuss their problems with them. But that was in fact what happened, and the students were of course greatly inspired. And from then onwards, every 3 years I went to the physics, CERN sent me to the physics meetings, and later on I became more and more involved with it, and when I retired they asked me whether I would encourage British students, because I went back to England, British students to join these meetings in the 3 disciplines, physics, chemistry, and medicine. And I did that, and I encouraged, even in those early years, that was in the 90s, the EPS should perhaps sponsor a student or so to join this annual venue in physics every 3 years. And it was thanks to Professor Martin Huber that it finally succeeded. In 2004, the EPS first sponsored a Finnish student, and then the following year, 2005, 2 students from the University of Mulhouse. So in effect, that just brought me full circle. My activity, early activity from EPS resulted in something which I did at CERN and is now hopefully continuing.
Thank you. So you gave us a lot of interesting stories and anecdotes. So if you want to add anything if there is anything you want to tell us?
No, the only thing is that I've witnessed at CERN, I mean, I was there from 68 to 85. 68 was a period of enormous growth, positive attitudes, followed by a certain malaise, if you like, where things weren't very clear. We were rivaling the United States. The United States were going to build the biggest machine, and that was suddenly cancelled. Then we built another big accelerator, lab, which is Professor Schopper's particular work. And in that tunnel, which was built for LEP, for the Large Electron Positron Collider, is now the Large Hadron Collider, which will come into operation hopefully this summer. The tunnel is there, but the machine is completely different and new. So I have witnessed, in effect, the early accelerators, which are still working, but a family has grown to an enormous size and is now become a world laboratory. It was a member, they had a number of, say, 13 member states. It's now well over 20 or 25. And so it's become, that's what I've witnessed, the growth of an international collaboration. My first impression, having worked in England, a national laboratory, to come into an international growing laboratory, to first meet Germans, Italians, French, all working with the same aim, all interested in the same physics and the same natural phenomena and problems, was quite a startling experience. And that's gone on and has grown to a worldwide collaboration now. And similarly with EPS, I mean, it was European countries, okay, but it was very restricted, very limited. National societies perhaps didn't collaborate as they should have done, but and very little support from governments. But I see now, and I still see the Europhysics news, I see now that it's become a worldwide effort, and it's no longer really only European, but although its heart is still in Europe, but it becomes more, like science in general, becomes more worldwide. Nobel Prize winners from all over the world come and go and so on. So that's my experience. I have 2 organizations going from very little modest starts to become worldwide international collaborations in a very, very positive sense. While the politicians still quarrel and fight in economy, there is still at least two organizations who, in spite of all the difficulties, sponsor international collaboration.
Thank you very much.